Hi everyone, and welcome to Lecture 6. This lecture is looking at the idea of different curriculum approaches and how that influences our planning. And the particular ones that we're going to look at are the Reggio Emilia, Montessori and the anti-bias curriculum. So let's do a quick review of planning. So for us, when we're working, whether it is in a childcare centre or in a school-based environment, planning is a requirement for us. We have to have potentially something that we give to our administration. It provides us as a guide for our action that we're going to do in the classroom. It helps us to identify what's going on with the children and then make sure that we're catering for them in the best way possible. We do planning for the short term, tomorrow, the next day, and so on, but also for the longer term. What do we want to have done and have the children be able to achieve and demonstrate by the end of the year? Planning really is the key to our success as an early years educator, and I, as well as lots and lots of other people, consider it absolutely essential. There's a number of schools and centres you'll go into that will say, oh, planning's, we post plan. The reality is that you need to have some type of planning for the future. So let's have a look at our cycle. So when we're thinking about our planning cycle, we're planning based on our observations. We're then enacting our planning by doing it in some way, and we're reflecting and evaluating. At the core of it, we always keep the children's interests and motivation. What do they want to do? What do they love doing? And so on. But around the outside, we also have to be really cognizant of the fact that we have our professional and personal values, beliefs and principles. We've got the parent values, beliefs and expectations. And then, of course, we have our workplace and community that says these are the certain things that the children need to be doing. So let's look at our different levels of planning. So when we're thinking about planning, we have school planning that is done for us and with us, and that's key operational plans, strategic plans that go over a number of years. They could be directly related to large plans from the Education Department or the Catholic Ed Office and so on. You've then got your year curriculum. So for pre-primary to year 3, we have very set curriculum. Our kindies is a little bit more of a guideline. And then up until kindy, it really is the curriculum that is determined by what your centre or your school wishes to do. So then you break that down into your term program, and that may be based on learning areas, it may be based on domains, it might be based on interest areas. So you've got a way that you then determine that. You then have a daily work pad that says, right, this is what I'm planning for the day, or most of the time teachers will have a daily work pad that actually goes over an entire week. And then, of course, you have your specific activity planning, where you then decide, right, this is what I'm doing today. So if we have a look at it, it starts yearly down to daily, and we have our long term down to our short term. So your activity planning is your very short term. What are we doing after lunch? And then your longer term is those strategic plans and operational plans. So we have to think, what are we actually making sure that we cover? And that's where you need to be guided by the school plans, the year curriculum, the term programs. Some of those will be 100% under your control, but some of them will be not under your control, and they'll be determined by other parties. So let's have a look at how we then take our planning and what do we actually plan for. So when we're planning, we need to think about how we plan for the obvious, the curriculum. Again, our pre-primaries to year 3s, we have very set curriculum. We have to plan for it. It's how we are accredited as a school. You can't ignore the curriculum. It needs to be taken into account. We look for what is our teaching mode. Are we working with the whole class? Are we working with a small group? How are we going to organise ourselves? Are we doing direct instruction? Are we doing collaborative? What are the different strategies that will then facilitate that teaching mode? We then have to think about, of course, what are we going to be wanting to assess? Because then that determines how we plan. Do I want something that I will be able to keep, so I make it as a digital record and pop it in my OneNote? Do I put it up onto Seesaw? Do I have it as a paper that's going into the portfolio that's going home to parents? What's my assessment? I always need to make sure that I'm planning for not just the cognitive development, but all the other aspects of the child. So how am I planning to develop good intrapersonal skills? How am I making sure that my environment complements and supports whatever I'm planning for? So if I'm doing planning, my environment is an essential element of that planning. I need to plan what goes where. I need to plan out and have a guide of my time. Is this something that's just a one activity that I'll be doing? Is it going to be done over an entire week? Is it an assessment that I want to complete over 2 weeks and do it individual with every single child? So my planning is important for that. I then, of course, have my human resources. So do I have EAs in the room? Do I have support workers who are coming in to work with different people? What have I got that's going on that I need to take into account with the human part of everything? And of course, we've got our materials. Now, we all go in and out of early years rooms, and we know they have an absolute abundance of materials. Thinking about how, when, and why you use those materials is very important. You don't want to have all materials out all the time. Children will get fatigued from seeing the same things all the time. You want to be able to rotate things, so you plan to have different materials at different times. When you're working in a pre-kindy or a kindy or a childcare, there's materials that are specifically suited to different developmental needs. So you bring those out at different points and you plan actively to involve them in your different activities that you are setting up for the students. So always keep in mind, your planning needs to be flexible, and make sure that you're adapting to the interests and needs, as well as obviously all your external things that are going on. However, I have a firm belief you have to have a plan for your year and where you want to go. So you need to have an idea of, right, this is where we're heading. By the end of the year, I will expect and hope that all of the children will be able to do this and this and this. So for my kindies, for example, I would always expect that every child was able to confidently write their own name by the end of the year. By halfway through the year, I wanted them to confidently be able to identify their name and tell me some of the letters, and then to be able to write it by themselves by the end of the year. Of course, you will have some children that within the second week of kindy are able to write their names, but I would have kind of like my line in the sand of where I wanted to make sure every child was moving to. Then I had my curriculum points of things like I wanted them to be able to know all their numbers to 10 and to be able to start to do one-to-one correspondence with those numbers. I wanted them to be able to recognize all the letters, as many as possible, of the alphabet. They might not be able to write them, but they could at least recognize those letters. And I would have probably half of the students being able to do that by the end of kindy, and so that set them up really well to go into pre-primary. It didn't mean that I did explicit teaching lessons with them. It meant that they were just lots of the different activities that I did, and we used it as all our environmental print and incidentals. So I made sure that they were working towards where I wanted them to get to by my planning activities. Always keep in mind when we're working with young children that sometimes they take a very long time to do a really basic thing, and that's okay. We need to learn and practice rather than moving on to the next thing. I would rather do less activities and have every child be successful in those small number of activities rather than thinking, oh goodness, we've got to do this and this and this and this and this and so on. Small is better because then you make sure that you are spending time with every child. You make sure that every child is feeling successful in their work and that they're bringing that sense of self and agency into all of the activities that they do. They need time to practice things. So when we're thinking about our planning, we have to always keep in mind what is our approach that we want to have. So what's our curriculum? So we've got a curriculum that is determined by some documents, but then you've also got the how of how you teach those documents. So what are your beliefs and teaching philosophies? And you make sure that it all kind of aligns as much as possible. So let's have a look at 3 of the common ones that are used in our schools. And what you'll find is that some of these are mentioned, as we found in our childcare centres, but they also sometimes the personal philosophies of teachers, as well as the clear explicit philosophy that's embedded through the centre that they're working in. So our first one that we're going to look at is probably the most common that you will hear referred to, the Reggio Emilia approach. So when we look at this curriculum approach, we need to keep in mind that you're using this approach and it influences what you do. You can't say you're a Reggio Emilia school because the only schools are the ones that are in Northern Italy. So a Reggio Emilia school, a Reggio Emilia approach, is based on the work of our founder, Loris, I'm not sure how to say the surname, but essentially it originated in a town in Northern Italy. And it's based on our key theorists of Piaget, Dewey, Vygotsky and Brunner. And we're looking at this idea that all children are capable and confident, that the children, they're just so full of potential and wonder and curiosity. So how do we capitalize on that? So Loris lived from 1920 to 1994 and was interested in this small group of women that led a preschool in Reggio Emilia. And he threw his support behind that initiative. And he went on to lead this movement to grow. And so today he's thought of as the founder of the approach. It's based on those theorists in that it values the socio-cultural context. So Vygotsky talks about this socio-cultural context. We construct our world based on the people around it, as well as the world and the way that we view it. So these influence the child. The view of the child is that they are capable, they're born with potential, wonder and curiosity. So therefore they're constructors of their own knowledge. As adults, we're participants in that construction of the knowledge. We help them to facilitate, observe, we document, we provoke, we possibly do minimal direction. The relationships with others, that is really important. The involvement of the families provides an integral part of that Reggio approach. So when we look at the Reggio, some of the key things, the child has 100 languages and all require nurturing. The child, it's the way that they experience, they express, they do, and they know. There's not just one way. So it's not saying they actually have 100 different languages. It's saying that their way of learning and play is viewed as closely connected. So play provides the method for those languages or ways of learning. It's got a few distinctive characteristics, and it focuses on the arts and the natural world. And it makes sure that we look at this idea that learning and play are not separated. We don't have learning and then we go out to play. It's that the play-based environment underpins the learning. It's not that the learning is separate to the play. We make sure that we are definitely involving the children. So we're responding to the children and using their senses and engaging them in lots of hands-on. I love the idea that it's very focused on the natural world and that we have the arts that is involved. You'll often find in a Reggio school or centre an atelier or an artist studio. So some of the early years childcare centres that you will go into, they will have these beautiful studios set up. It's a space for the creative arts. It's a space for technology. It's a space for the children to explore and be creative. So you want to make sure that you have these projects that encourage this deep learning rather than the superficial filling in a worksheet and so on. So when we look at it, the environment is our third teacher. So a lot of the Reggio inspired rooms that you'll go into, they're beautiful. They inspire learning and they inspire that idea of creativity. You'll find lots of natural things in them and not a lot of plastic sitting in there. Our piazza is that community space for gathering, and it's very important. You think if you've ever been overseas, you'll know that a lot of our European nations, they have this idea of building spaces where they have people gather. It's not something that we do all the time in Australia, but it's often in the piazza. It's separate from the classroom. It's where that people can meet and discuss observations and their ideas and document things and so on. So if you want to find out a little bit more, which is always a really good thing in our early years because we have so many of our childcare centres, our kindies and our pre-primaries that mention the Reggio Emilia approach influencing the work that they do. So there is an Australian Association for Reggio Emilia, and there is a number of books and resources that you can read as well. So our next one to have a look at is the Montessori. Now, in WA, we are so lucky. We've got a number of Montessori early learning centres, and we've got a number of schools that go up to year 6. We've also got at least one high school as well. So traditionally, the Montessori method focuses on children from birth to 6 years, and that's where you'll find most of them are very young. But we do have a number of full primary schools, so they take the Montessori method all the way through. Now, this is different from Reggio. Reggio, you don't need a formal qualification. You can go over to Italy and do a full Reggio training course and so on. To be a Montessori teacher, however, you must do a full certified training course in addition to your undergraduate teaching course. So a Montessori teacher is a fully qualified teacher as well as has a Montessori training certification as well. And I love going into Montessori rooms and seeing the amazing things that happen in there. So Dr. Maria Montessori established what is known as the Montessori method in the 1800s, so a very long time ago. She immersed herself in good educational psychology of the time, the philosophy and anthropology that she learned about children from observing them. So her own philosophy was developed from sitting back, observing, and that then became the Montessori method. It's based on 10 key principles. And the quote sums up the role of the educator in it. A child needs freedom within limits. A lot of people think that a Montessori environment has no limits. You'll actually find quite the opposite. I find that sometimes our Montessori schools and centres are even more organised and structured than a lot of our quote unquote play-based environments. So there's a very prepared environment. So the activities are set up in advance. They're challenging but not too difficult. The activities are all at the height of the child, so everything is teeny tiny depending on the age that you are working with. And what I particularly like is that the space is always beautiful, but I find that it is far less cluttered than a lot of the environments I go into. It's even what you would call minimalist when you go into some Montessori centres. And some people kind of go, oh, there's not a lot. But what it is a lot of the things are put away and then brought out. It's not the same degree of clutter that we often encounter in our early years centres. The second thing is that we capitalise on this natural desire that children have to learn. So Maria believed that every child had that desire to learn, and so the kids will go through that process of building wonder and a love of learning through your activities. A toddler's work is play. We've all seen little kids pick up the vacuum cleaner and want to do exactly what they see modelled by mummy or daddy. We see them picking up books and reading them if that's what they have seen being done. Just like you will see them picking up cigarettes and pretending to smoke them if that's what they've seen modelled. So a toddler's work is play. They're not separate. Of course, we know children are intrinsically curious, so therefore they will want to do lots and lots of different things. They're not going to just sit back and watch. They're going to want to participate in some way. Now, the third principle is that we must have hands-on and concrete learning. Some of the Montessori materials are the most beautiful, practical things that you will ever see. A lot of wooden materials, they're just gorgeous. So the materials are attractive and inviting, so the children are always wanting to explore them. So this is a little one playing. I love this. Look at the repeating of the activity. The intense concentration on him. And so each activity has a reason and a purpose in the room. So we have sensitive periods. So that's where we look at certain developmental times when we are building this idea of movement, language, and so on. We make sure that we are always keying into their interests. We have the unconscious absorbent mind. So this is the idea that children take in the information effortlessly. Before the age of 3, it's unconscious as well. They're just seeing and noticing everything around them. That is the idea that I always worry about, is that negative experiences are learnt just as quickly as positive. So we have to ensure we always have positive role models. We want to make sure that we have beautiful sets of freedoms and limits, and that Montessori believed we should not let them do whatever they want. She wanted them to have freedom within limits, with respect and responsibility. It's about being able to play, choose what tasks to play with, and then be involved in the tasks that relate to them. But this idea of independence is valued, and that is our 7th principle, independence and responsibility. So it connects with the previous principle. They complete their tasks independently, they clean up after themselves and learn to be responsible. So I'll never forget going out to see a kindy, and normally in a kindy, if they do painting, every EA does a little sigh and goes, oh, at cleaning up. I went out to this kindy, the children pinned their own paper onto the easel, they painted, they did not mix all the paints. When they had finished painting, they lifted their painting, they popped it onto the drying rack, they went back, there was a bucket and sponge next to the easel, they wiped the easel down, they rinsed out the sponge, popped it over the side of the bucket and left it as beautiful as they had arrived. So that to me really showed the idea of that independence and responsibility. It was just magical to see, and it really showed me that it can be built into what we do in classrooms. So this idea of individual development, every child develops at their own timeline. There's no universal child that everyone should do this at the same time. However, this is something that I find our more mainstream classes don't do as much, that I see it done a lot in a Montessori room. There's a lot of repetition. So children do the same thing quite often, and they absolutely love it. I just find they really enjoy the fact that they can master that, but you make sure everything is related to the real world. So an idea about respect, and this is something that I really notice in a Montessori centre as well. The adults always ask the children rather than telling the children. There's always limits. There's a clear differentiation between adults and children in there, but there's a high level of respect. It's not just a telling them at all time. And respect between children is also encouraged, hence the cleaning up after yourself and so on. And then the final one is observation. So we watch and we report on the facts rather than assuming and rather than interpreting. We're just being very factual. We observe the child in their learning and their play, and we facilitate that in the best way possible. And we try not to interrupt, which is really hard for most of us. So there are 10 key principles of Montessori. If you find out a little bit more, The Montessori Toddler is a great book by Simone Davis. And you've of course got the Montessori Australia website. that has lots and lots of interesting things, and also talks to you a little bit more about some of the training if you are interested in doing this. We have had a number of students go on to do Montessori. We've had a number of our students go on to do their pracs in Montessori schools as well, if that's something that you're interested in. It's important that you understand the process before you make those choices though. So let's have a look at our third one, our anti-bias curriculum. So with our anti-bias curriculum, what we need to make sure is that our research shows us the process of identity and attitude development conclude that children learn by observing differences and similarities among people and by absorbing the spoken and unspoken messages about the differences. So what's the goal of an anti-bias curriculum? In our world at the moment, we need to be really aware of how we present people, stereotypes, information, all those sorts of things. So we want to make sure that we're constructing a good, knowledgeable, confident self-identity. We want to make sure that we're helping children have comfortable, empathetic interactions with people from diverse backgrounds, and that we are doing some critical thinking about bias. And really importantly, how are we helping the children to stand up for themselves in the face of bias? We don't want them just accepting, oh, that's just what you do to that person because of that reason. We never want to have that perpetuated, because as we know, children don't come with a bias. We help them develop it. So we need to establish and recognize our own bias, those of the class, and those of the society that we're existing in. And they will change depending on where you are and who you are mixing with. We need to help parents understand how children develop their identity and attitudes. But this becomes really tricky because parents are already coming in with their own biases. So we need to be really conscious about this. So what can you do? First of all, discard materials with stereotypes. It doesn't matter if they cost a whole lot of money. They are not appropriate. We do not use them in an early years centre. We make sure that everything we have is suitable, neutral, doesn't perpetuate any stereotypes of any sort. So we make sure that we have different coloured babies in the dramatic play centre. We make sure when we do our cutouts of our people that we're gluing things onto, that there are different colours of them, that there are, not just a mummy and a daddy, but all the different types of family structures that you could have. We're not just talking about nuclear families and so on. We make sure that all our resources depict a variety of cultures. So if you have a huge amount of cultures in your classroom, you need to go and buy some more things. You need to talk to your leadership team so that you do not just have everything that portrays a white family in any way. You make sure where possible that you are celebrating the holidays relevant to the class community. Find out from community members when are there special holidays coming up and talk about them with your class. Always check with the school to make sure that you're not going to create more of a problem for yourself with it though. Make sure that you are taking into account everyone. There's certain cultures that don't celebrate certain holidays for certain reasons. Be really aware you're not creating any of those conflicts. So with your anti-bias curriculum, you want to make sure that you're creating a culturally relevant curriculum and that it is not including any bias. But you need to possibly go through and have a look at what your potential stereotypes and biases are so that you can make sure that you are neutralizing those as much as possible. So let's do a quick summary. When we're looking at planning, assessment is our first step. We consider our philosophy, the school and centre context, and that of your students. You always consider what is your approach to the curriculum. Doesn't need to be just one approach, but you might have multiples. And you begin to plan within the framework of all of those things intersecting in different ways. So hopefully that has shown you 3 different curriculums. Next week we'll go through another couple of different curriculums as well, just so you have an idea before your philosophy is due of which things are starting to help you form your ideas of your core beliefs. So thanks everyone, and I will talk to you all during tutorials.